Do you remember Thomas the Tank Engine? Maybe you had a Thomas train set. Maybe you watched the show every morning before school. Maybe you had one of those little wooden or plastic Thomas trains that somehow ended up underneath your bed. You had all the tracks, and if your dog absolutely bit all over those train tracks, yeah, they're just not going to fit into place. Or maybe you just remember that iconic blue engine with the number one on its side, and that is Thomas. But here's something you might not know. Thomas the Tank Engine is much older than most of us realize. The character dates all the way back to 1945, and over the next 80 years, Thomas would go from a father's bedtime story to children books to one of the most recognizable children's television franchises in the world. So today, let's go all the way back to the beginning and find out what actually happened to Thomas the Tank Engine. To understand Thomas, we have to go back to 1942. A British railway enthusiast named Reverend Wilbur Awdry had a young son named Christopher, who was sick with measles and stuck in bed. To keep his son entertained, Audrey began telling him stories about trains. And these weren't random bedtime stories. Audrey had loved trains since he was a child, and he imagined locomotives as characters with personalities. The sounds of real steam engines even inspired him. To Audrey, the noises of locomotives could almost sound like they were talking to each other. Eventually, he started writing these stories down, and in 1945, the first book of what would become known as the Railway series was published. The first book was called The Three Railway Engines, and here's the crazy part: Thomas wasn't even in it. Thomas wouldn't make his debut until the second Railway series book, Thomas the Tank Engine, published in 1946. So the character who would eventually become the face of the entire franchise wasn't even there at the beginning. Before Thomas became the star, there was already an entire railway world. The first book introduced three important engines. You have Edward, Gordon, and Henry, and each one had a completely different personality. Edward. Edward was one of the oldest and wisest engines. He was kind, patient, and extremely helpful. He wasn't interested in proving he was the fastest or strongest. Edward represented one of the biggest ideas in the entire franchise. Being useful isn't about being the biggest engine. He could pull trains, shunt cars, and help other engines, even though he was considered an older design. Gordon. There's Gordon. Gordon was huge, powerful, and fast. He pulled the prestigious express passenger train and was extremely proud of it. And Gordon knew exactly how important he was. He could be arrogant and boastful, which made him a perfect contrast to Thomas. Thomas was the little engine trying to prove himself, while Gordon was the giant express engine who already believed he was the best. Then there's Henry. Henry was a green engine with a complicated early history. His original design was inspired by a real locomotive concept that wasn't particularly successful. Eventually, Henry was rebuilt in the Railway series. So Henry essentially had two different versions of his character history. He was also more sensitive than Gordon. Henry could become nervous and concerned about what the other engines thought of him. Then came Thomas. Thomas was introduced in the second Railway series book in 1946, and he was different from the larger engines. Thomas was a tank engine. Instead of having a separate tender carrying coal and water behind him, a tank engine carries its supplies on the locomotive itself. That made Thomas smaller and more maneuverable, and his personality was established almost immediately. He was cheeky, ambitious, impatient, and sometimes a little too confident. Thomas wanted to be important. He wanted his own branch line, and most importantly, he wanted to become a really useful engine. That phrase would eventually become one of the most famous parts of the entire franchise. Then there was the other engines. Thomas wasn't alone for long. The Railway series kept introducing characters who would eventually become famous through television. James was a red mixed traffic engine. He was proud of his appearance, very proud. James liked being shiny and believed he was special. That gave him a huge personality and made him another great contrast to Thomas. Percy was a small green tank engine. He was younger and less experienced than many of the others and became one of Thomas's closest friends. Percy helped make Sodor feel like a real community instead of simply a place where Thomas happened to live. Then there was Toby. Toby was a tram engine designed to operate on railway lines that could run alongside roads. His wooden looking sides and distinctive cow catchers made him instantly recognizable. Unlike some of the younger engines, Toby was calm, experienced, and dependable. Duck. Duck's real name was Montauk. Although everyone called him Duck, he was a Great Western Railway engine and was extremely proud of his railway heritage. Duck was knowledgeable and often believed he knew exactly how a proper railway should operate. Donald and Douglas. Then came the Scottish twins, Donald and Douglas. They were two nearly identical black tender engines. Their similar appearance was actually part of their charm because people could have trouble telling them apart. They were hardworking, loyal, and often worked together. Then there's Sir Topham Hatt, better known to many fans as the Fat Controller. He was the manager of the railway and the authority figure of Sodor. The engines wanted to impress him. If they caused trouble, they had to answer to him, and his most famous idea was simple: be a really useful engine. Here's something that made the original book so special. Wilbert Awdry wasn't just making up random colorful trains, he was a serious railway enthusiast. Many of the engines were inspired by real British locomotives. Thomas was based partly on the appearance of the LBN SCR E2 class tank engines, although the fictional Thomas isn't an exact replica. Gordon was inspired by the famous LNER A1/A3 Pacific type. Henry's original design also had a real world locomotive inspiration. This attention to railway history is why the original stories could feel much more realistic than a typical children's cartoon. There were different types of engines, passenger trains, freight trains, branch lines, shunning, stations, and actual railway rules. Audrey wasn't simply creating characters, he was creating an entire railway system. And that brings us to Sodor. Sodor is the fictional island where Thomas and his friends live. Wilbert Awdry and his brother George created the island as a setting for the railway series, and they made it much more detailed than it needed to be. Sodor had towns, stations, harbors, factories, farms, mines, bridges, tunnels, branch lines, and main lines. It was designed to feel like a real railway network. That's one reason Thomas could keep getting new stories. There was always somewhere else for an engine to go. There was always another station, another job, another railway problem, and another character who could enter the story. The original Thomas wasn't really created as a simple show about cute trains. It was about railways, real railway operations, different locomotives, freight, passengers shunning, and the personalities of the engines working inside that system. And that's why the stories could sometimes be surprisingly serious. An engine could break down, get stuck, make a mistake, or get embarrassed, but there was usually a lesson. The message wasn't simply, Thomas is a cute blue train. It was, do your job, help others, don't let your ego get in the way, and try to be a really useful engine. Wilbert Awdry continued writing the Railway series for decades. Between 1945 and 1972, he wrote 26 books. Eventually, his son Christopher Awdry continued the series. The final Railway series book was published in 2011. That's an incredible run of more than 6 decades. But Thomas was about to become much bigger than books because a woman named Britt Allcroft was about to bring him to television. In the late 1970s, British television producer Britt Allcroft discovered the Railway series while working on a documentary about steam railways. She became fascinated by the books, but turning them into television was going to be expensive. Allcroft spent years trying to get the project made and eventually obtained the television rights. According to accounts of her career, she even mortgaged her house while working to get Thomas onto television. That's how much she believed in the idea. And in 1984, it finally happened. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends premiered on British television, and Thomas changed forever. If you grew up with Thomas in the 2000s, this is probably one of the coolest things about the original series. The original show wasn't a cartoon. Thomas wasn't originally trying to be this fancy cartoon or the next big thing. The show used real physical miniature models. The engines were carefully constructed, models running on miniature railway sets. Cameras filmed them like miniature movies. The faces were physical pieces attached to the locomotives. The smoke was real, the tracks were real, the sets were real. Everything was miniature, but it looked like an actual railway. That's why the original Thomas has such a unique atmosphere. It wasn't just animation, it felt like you were watching a tiny world that actually existed. When Thomas came to America, the franchise received an enormous boost from someone you probably wouldn't expect: Ringo Starr. Yes, you heard that right, the drummer from the Beatles. Ringo Starr narrated the original American version of Thomas and Friends. His voice became one of the defining sounds of Thomas for an entire generation. Later, George Carlin became another famous American narrator. Thomas went from British railway books to a children's television show narrated by a Beatle. That's pretty crazy. Thomas also became extremely popular in America through Shining Time Station. The series premiered in 1989 and combined Thomas stories with a live action American setting. It introduced Thomas to kids who might never have encountered the Railway series. And once Thomas reached American homes, he exploded. Thomas wasn't just a television character anymore. He became toys, books, VHS tapes, DVDs, video games, lunchboxes, bedroom decorations, train sets. If you were a kid in the 1990s or 2000s, Thomas was basically everywhere. You could watch him on television, then play with him, then read about him, and then go to sleep surrounded by Thomas merchandise. That's how a children's character becomes a childhood icon. By the late 1990s, Thomas was big enough for a feature film, and in 2000, we got Thomas and the Magic Railroad. The movie combined the Thomas world with the American Shining Time Station universe, featured Thomas, Sir Topham Hatt, and Sodor, alongside human characters, and it even starred Alec Baldwin. But unfortunately, the movie wasn't the huge theatrical success everyone hoped for. Britt Allcroft eventually left the company she had built around Thomas, and the franchise entered another major transition: the CGI era. By the late 2000s, computer animation was becoming the standard for children's television, and Thomas was about to change. The production began moving away from physical models. The transition started around Series 12, where CGI was increasingly incorporated. Then came the 2009 special, Hero of the Rails. This was a huge moment. It became the first Thomas production made completely with CGI. Suddenly, Thomas could move in ways the physical models couldn't. His face could change more easily, the camera could travel around Sodor, the characters could perform more complicated movements, and eventually, the miniature railway era was over. The CGI era had arrived. The CGI era continued for years. Thomas and Friends introduced new characters, locations, and stories while becoming increasingly focused on educational themes. But in 2021, Thomas changed again. Thomas and Friends All Engines Go premiered, and this wasn't simply an upgrade, it was a complete reimagining. The classic CGI look was replaced with bright 2D animation, the characters became more expressive, the movement became more exaggerated, the stories became faster, and Thomas was presented more like a young kid learning about the world. If you grew up with the classic Thomas, you probably noticed immediately this wasn't the Thomas you remembered. So you're thinking, why did Thomas change? Thomas had always had to evolve with the children watching him. The original model series was made for television audiences in the 1980s. Then CGI became the standard. So eventually Mattel wanted Thomas to appeal to a new generation of preschoolers. So All Engines Go emphasized physical comedy, brighter animation, and more expressive characters. It wasn't designed to erase the old Thomas, it was designed to introduce Thomas to a new generation. And the characters themselves changed too. In 2022, Thomas introduced Bruno the Brake Car, the franchise's first autistic character. So Thomas wasn't only changing visually, the world of Thomas was changing with the times. And you might think the story ends there. It doesn't, because in 2026, Thomas is changing again. Mattel announced a major franchise relaunch, and this time they're looking back at more than 80 years of Thomas history. Mattel unveiled a refreshed Thomas design and logo in January 2026. The new franchise draws inspiration from the franchise's history, including its original railway culture and storytelling. And it's not just about television. The new era includes toys, books, YouTube content, live experiences, and more. Mattel also announced a new Easy Connect toy system featuring redesigned track, magnetic connectors, and new engines. So Thomas has gone through books, miniature models, live action television segments, CGI, 2D animation, and now another new era. Think about how strange Thomas's history really is. A father tells stories to his sick son in the 1940s. Those stories become children books. One little blue engine eventually becomes the star. A television producer becomes obsessed with bringing these books to television. The show uses miniature trains. A beetle becomes the narrator. Thomas becomes a worldwide toy empire. He gets a movie, he switches to CGI, then he becomes a 2D character, and now, more than 80 years after the character's creation, Thomas is still being reinvented. That's not just a children's show, that's a piece of childhood history. And that's the crazy thing about nostalgia. When we were kids, we didn't think about any of this. We didn't know who Wilbert Audrey was. We didn't know who Britt Allcroft was. We didn't know that those little trains were actually carefully constructed miniature models. We just saw Thomas and we watched. Maybe you had the toys. Maybe you had the VHS tapes. Maybe you watched Thomas before school. Maybe your parents bought you a giant Thomas train set. And years later, you see that blue engine again. And suddenly, you are 5 years old. Thomas the Tank Engine has survived multiple generations, multiple animation styles, multiple companies, and completely different eras of children's entertainment. And somehow, Thomas is still going. From A Bedtime Story in 1942 to The Island of Sodor to your childhood bedroom to the screen you're watching right now, Thomas really did become a really useful engine, and honestly, that's one of the coolest nostalgia stories ever.